Hello again, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back continuing our YouTube Sunday School lessons. This is descended from the Sunday School class we had at Jerome United Methodist Church here in Dublin, Ohio before the pandemic hit. And we've been working our way, we've done the whole New Testament, and we're now early in the Old Testament. This is our second Old Testament lesson on Genesis. We're going to be dealing with the middle part of Genesis. And this is a scholarly, intellectually oriented class, and the scholars have a lot of hesitation about how much of the stories in Genesis are historically oriented, accurate from the history sense, and how much of them are legend, almost bordering on mythology, about ancestral chains. So the scholars usually just ignore it, and they say basically that Genesis does a couple things. It just shows the pattern of migration as to how the Hebrew people migrated into the Canaanite area and then went down into Egypt. But they really describe it as a lengthy introduction to the Exodus. The Exodus is clearly the most pivotal event in the early history of Judaism. It clearly what formed the religion and formed the population into a group and bonded them together with all the strengths and weaknesses that humans have. And it was the Exodus event that is pivotal. So that really the book of Genesis is simply a link in the scholarly community, is a lengthy introduction to set the stage for the Exodus. Some New Testament scholars say something similar, that the New Testament Gospels are essentially passion and resurrection stories with lengthy introductions. I don't necessarily buy that. I think we have a lot we can learn from Jesus' teaching in those introductions, but that's a different approach. But without the passion and crucifixion and resurrection, the stories would not have the impact that they do now worldwide. So I understand how people can say that. So we're going to just skim over parts of this story with Genesis, trying to put it in proper context to give us some background as to how different the understanding of the religious thought was at the time. You'll see that the understanding of God is very different than it is now, and the relationship is very different than it is now. And so it's just part of the evolution of our understanding of our relationship with God. So the fundamental story of Abraham, which is what we're going to focus on, is the story of the migration of the ancestors of the Hebrew people from the civilized areas of Mesopotamia. And he, by legend, came from Ur of the Chaldees, which was one of the original cities in the Mesopotamia, the river valley between the Tigris and Euphrates, and now what is in lower Iraq. Civilization started there where the Tigris and Euphrates come out. It's an area called Sumer. In 3000 BC, it got civilized about the same time that Egypt got civilized, about 3000 BC. And Abram was his name at the time. He migrated from Ur of the Chaldees up the rivers, which run from the southeast to the northwest. There's a long river valley up into a place called Haran, Haran, in what is now southeast Turkey, in the Kurdish area of southeast Turkey. And he was based there, and his family group is based there. And if you do read a lot of the rest of Genesis, his family will migrate back and forth from the Canaan area, where he migrates down subsequently to find wives and family relations and back and forth. But that's the original site, and then God tells him to migrate down to the south into what became later the Promised Land. Now, this follows a natural course of migration, because most of the history indicates that part of what's now Holy Land, Syria, Israel, Jordan, was pretty much empty at the time that Abraham would have been there, which is way back, probably 1800 BC, way back, and because there weren't nearly as many people. And Abraham was clearly, from the account, a migratory animal herdsman. He was wealthy and prosperous, and had large families, but he lived off the herds, and you migrate with the herds. So as your food supply and water supply change, you migrate to a different place. So he had this migratory pattern. This was natural of what he would have done. In the account, as we've talked before, at this point you still have the three different sources, and you can actually, as you read the chapter, some of the chapters are divided where the new narrative starts. You'll get the old epic account, which is primarily the Yahwist J account. There is some other old epic which uses Elohim as the word for God instead of Yahweh. And then there's the priestly, which is much more organized and direct and has a lot of genealogy and things like that. You can see these accounts, and they'll often stop with the various chapters, and they'll flow back and forth. With that, you'll see some repeat stories. You'll find twice in the account, Abram is trying to disguise that his wife Sarai, which is the Eastern terminology, says that it was his sister because he's afraid powerful people will kill him to get her away because she's so beautiful. It's a very odd stories, and you see it repeated once in Egypt and once in a different kingdom. So you do find certain of these repeats. And as you'll find the migratory pattern, God has Abram go up the Fertile Crescent, go up to Haran, and then come back down and settle through various sites in the land of Palestine, Canaan. First at Shechem. Shechem is up in the Galilee in modern times. It was the old northern kingdom, but it was the traditional central religious site in that part of the Galilee, which is more fertile than the land farther south around Jerusalem. And if you remember your story of Joshua, after they conquered the Holy Land, he had a gathering of a covenant renewal ceremony, chapter 24 of Joshua. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God, comes from that. And essentially the conquering, invading tribes were offering the new Yahweh faith to their cousin tribes who were already in the area, offering them to join in with the Exodus people rather than oppose them. And that was at Shechem. There's a traditional religious site there. They used to have religious gatherings and political gatherings of the tribes and even in the kingdoms at that site. And then he goes farther south to Bethel. Bethel was kind of in between Shechem and Jerusalem. Jerusalem's farther south at this time. And eventually he ends up down at Beersheba. Beersheba is the last city on the border of the Negev desert. And it's where there's water, and so they can have some civilization and housing and all that there because there's an adequate water supply. Once you get down the desert, the Negev is real desert. And this is again, he's the migratory herdsman. Now, chapter 15, you have the original covenant ceremony between God and Abram. And this is from the old epic, from the Yahwist source. And God promises Abram that he's going to have multiple generations, and his descendants will be like the stars of the heavens. They'll be numerous and powerful, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a little bit odd to Abram because he's childless at this time, and his wife has not had it. Sarah has not had any children. So Sarah gives him Hagar, one of her Egyptian handmaidens, as a concubine. This was not unusual at the time. Powerful men at the time had several wives and multiple concubines. Why would want that? I don't really know, but they did. And so she gives her the concubine, who becomes pregnant, which sets off a lot of tension between the pregnant concubine and the infertile wife. There's a lot of tension, and the concubine tries to flee, and the angels rescue her, and she comes back, and she has the son, and he's named Ishmael. And it's interesting that the Arab people now trace their lineage back to Ishmael and back to Abraham. So each, the Jewish and the Muslim Arab people, revere Abraham as their father, but just through two different children. The Arabs through Ishmael, and the Hebrew Jewish people through Isaac. Then the Lord has another visit with Abraham and does And when God appears at this time, God actually has a physical presence to these visits with Abraham. This is very unusual. As you get farther into the into the Jewish religion, you'll find that the perception of God changes. And if you look back at the history of ancient deity information, like the Greek or Roman gods, they're portrayed just like humans. They have human vices, they have human emotions, they have lust and anger and hatred and all these other things. So they're really more superhuman creations, but human with the characteristics. Now, in this part of Genesis, God has a much more physical form. He visits Abram or Abraham several times in physical form, looking like a human. But once you get past the Exodus, this stops. That if you remember when Moses is up on the mountain, he wants to see God, and God will let him see his back, and that's all. When hundreds of years later, Elijah flees down to the sacred mountain to escape his enemies, and the divine presence is there, and then there's a thunderstorm and a wind and lightning and all this, and God is not in any of those, and God is in the quiet afterwards, but he never sees God. God never takes a physical appearance. So the understanding of God moves along, and the God we deal with, we don't see. God is not portrayed as a human being. Yeah, people have portrayed him as this elderly, bearded person, but that's all stopped. In modern times, we don't portray God as a physical entity that we can touch and feel, but as a spiritual being that's universal. And also at the time of Abraham, there was no concept that there was just one God. Even until much later in the course of the Jewish nation, do they begin to understand that there's only one God, as opposed to Yahweh being their particular God and stronger than the gods of the Philistines and the Ammonites and the Moabites, which is the original understanding. So it's a very different appreciation of God, and we'll see this as we move through the Old Testament. Not till we get to the Babylonian exile that they begin to understand the concept of one God. Because if there's only one God, it's not just the God of the Hebrews, then it's the God of the Philistines and the Moabites and the Romans and the Greeks and everybody. It's only got one God, it's got to be God for everybody. So it's a very, very different concept. So at this point in the Abraham story, God appears in a physical form, and he calls himself El Shaddai. Nobody knows exactly what this means. El is the word in the languages of those times for Lord. It's the generic Lord. We use Lord with a capital to describe God. There are lords in the British House of Lords. It's an honorary rank. So it's a really generic term as opposed to a specific name, which was the Yahweh. And nobody knows what Shaddai means. Now, people have written nice Christian gospel songs, El Shaddai. I think Amy Grant had that one. But nobody really knows what Shaddai means. People have assumed it means Lord Most High, but that's not clear. And at this time, the meeting between God and Abram, they have a new covenant, a repeat of the covenant. So you can see how these stories repeat. There's several different covenant ceremonies. And this covenant is going to be based on circumcision. That all the subsequent Hebrew boys are to be circumcised on the 8th day. If you remember Paul's letter, when he described himself in Galatians as a true Hebrew circumcised on the 8th day. And that was a sign of being part of God's holy group with this people. And every male in the household had to be circumcised. And that's still a Jewish custom. All Jewish boys are circumcised. I'm not certain if they do it on the 8th day or not anymore. The Muslims circumcise all their males. That's a different age than the Muslims. Some of them are in infants. Some of them are 6 or 7 years old. Some of them, I think, you're supposed to be done before you get into puberty. Other tribal groups have circumcision or no circumcision. The Zulus in Africa circumcised all their people at puberty. And if you're going to be a true adult, you have to be circumcised. A physician I knew told me, used to work with them, told me an interesting story about he went up to the Zulu homeland a long time ago. It's a South African, before they got rid of apartheid. And he was being their doctor, and if you were a Zulu person and you knew you were going to be a thief, you didn't get yourself circumcised as you going into adulthood, because you couldn't be punished in Zulu culture if you weren't circumcised. And so these guys wouldn't get it done, and they'd be out stealing people's cattle, and tribal police would catch them. You have to have your own police. They'd bring him in and stand him there in front of this guy, and he would circumcise him with the traditional spear point circumcision to a 13, 14, 15-year-old. And I said to him, what did you use for anesthesia? And he said, nothing. They're very stoic people. And I thought, wow, that is stoic. But anyway, so circumcision is a rite in certain groups and not in others. Most American boys are circumcised in infancy as a hygienic thing for later adulthood. It's much easier hygiene if you're circumcised than if you're not, having, coming in this sort of medical thing. So, but this was part of their ritual. This was part of their identification. It's not as much as an identification thing now here in the U.S., but it still is in certain other groups. And at the same time, God tells Abram that he is to change his name to Abraham. Abraham is the Western Semitic language group form of the name, rather than the Eastern, which is Abram. And Sarai, his wife, becomes Sarah, and that's again changing the names to meet the proper ethnic group at the time. And there's another meeting later when he's down in a place called Mamre, which is down south of Jerusalem, and three men appear to him, one of whom is God, two of whom are angels, and he welcomes them effusively as a Bedouin is supposed to welcome strange travelers in their area, and has a feast for them and all that. And of the three, God tells Abraham, by this time he's Abraham, that he's going to have a son through his wife Sarah. Sarah hears him and laughs because she had gone through menopause, and she thought no chance. But you show that, and it proceeds into an odd discussion. God has decided to destroy the city of Sodom because they're so utterly immoral that they just need to be wiped out. So you have this man-like God figure appearing and talking to Abraham. Abraham argues with him, well, if I can find 50 righteous people, will you spare the city? God says, sure. How about 45? He bargains him all the way down to 10. It's an odd dialogue, not something we would attempt to do with God at this point, to bargain with him about what numbers of people are righteous and what aren't. So you'll see how these stories are steeped in legend from way, way back. When the understanding of God is totally different. It's more of like the tribal gods of the ancient times. And then you lead the story of how Sodom is destroyed. The two angels go to Lot's house. Lot is Abraham's nephew who had traveled with him, looped around the Fertile Crescent, had been with him all along. And Lot had moved into Sodom, and the angels go in to get him out. And there's some steamy stories about the immorality in the town, and the angels get Lot to flee, take him by the hand, and let's flee. And this is when and you have a fire and brimstone. It sounds like a volcanic eruption is what it sounds like, but I don't really know exactly what happened. And Sodom is to the south of the Dead Sea. If you if you've ever been to the Dead Sea, that Jericho's on the Dead Sea, and then farther south is where Qumran is, and around the bend of the southern edge of this, way down, you'll have the area where Sodom is supposed to have been. And it sounds like a volcanic eruption from what happened to it. And then Lot's wife turned back to look, and she turned into a pillar of salt. Then you have another odd story about Lot's two daughters who escaped with him were upset because they didn't have any men. They weren't going to be able to find husbands. So they get their father drunk, and each of them have sex with him and become pregnant. And so these incestuous relationships become the ancestor of the Moabites. Moab was a rival kingdom on the east side of Jordan, in the hills across from the Dead Sea, the eastern side of the Dead Sea. It's now in Jordan, and the Ammonites, or the other group, they're the kingdom to the north, up where the capital Amman is now. That's how Amman gets its name. So this is a way of saying that these kingdoms that are hostile to us came from this incestuous relationship with the nephew of Abraham. So these, as you can see, there's a lot of legend and trying to give negative connotations to the ancestry of the rival clans coming from Ishmael or Lot's incestuous relationships. And then Isaac is born, and he is circumcised on the 8th day properly. And then as he grows into a child, there's again an interesting, challenging story in which Abraham is instructed to take Isaac up on Mount Moriah and sacrifice him as a token of his love for the Lord. Now, this is a really difficult story, because if you study the Yahweh faith, as I have in the Old Testament, there's absolutely no evidence at any time, except for this story, of human sacrifice. Various other cultures had human sacrifice. Here in the New World, the Aztecs, it was a tremendous problem. Other cultures in the Middle East did human sacrifice. Some of the ancient Greek stories have human sacrifice. It's never been a part of the Yahweh faith, ever. So you have this one story, and Abraham's thinking, well, this is my only son, my only real son through my wife, and he gets this instruction to go up on Mount Moriah and sacrifice. Now, Mount Moriah is where the Dome of the Rock is in Jerusalem right now. This is sacred to the Jews because of the site of this potential sacrifice, sacred to the Muslims the same way, and to the Christians, of course. So this is where the Dome of the Rock is on Mount Moriah. And he goes up there, and Isaac's talking to him, where's the sheep that we're going to sacrifice, and they're carrying the wood with them. And he's about to slay his son, and the angel stops him, grabs his arm and stops him. And then he sees the ram stuck in the bushes, and he brings it down and sacrifices that. Now, it's difficult for me to understand exactly what the point of the story is, that other than the fact that Abraham was willing to sacrifice his only son as a demand from the Lord. But nowhere else in the Yahweh faith is there any expectation, actually condemnation, round condemnation of human sacrifice once you get into the later stories. So these are challenging stories to relate at this point. And it wraps up with the story of the burial cave. And this is where Hebron is now. If you've ever been to the Holy Land, Hebron is about 30 miles to the south of Jerusalem. And Abraham acquired an extensive cave network from the local person who owned it. And this is apparently, I've not been down in it, similar to the cave situation we have down in Kentucky around Mammoth Cave, where you have limestone and you'll have these underground rivers, and the underground river will dissolve the limestone. You'll get these extensive cave networks. And this is the cave network under there. And he buys this, and it was his burial place, not his wife. She had died somewhere else. And his descendants are buried there historically, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They bring Joseph's bones back from Egypt for this. And it's a very sacred place. The original structure on that site is built by King Herod. So this structure there goes back to the time of King Herod before the birth of Christ. There's a later Byzantine Christian structure attached to it, a Crusader structure attached on that. And the Muslims have made a mosque out of it. Now, I've seen the building, I haven't been in it, because it's a very touchy area. This building is extremely sacred to the Jewish people as Abraham's burial site. It's extremely sacred to the Muslim people as Abraham's burial site. So it's very tense, and there's been a lot of violence around the area. So I've seen it, but I haven't been inside it. There are rumors that the Israelis, once they captured it in 1967 after the Six-Day War, went down inside the cave. There are reports, nothing official, that they've looked through the cave and they found nothing. So that's the legendary burial site of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So that wraps up the story. You can see it's a difficult thing to present the whole context in the light of our understanding of God at this point, that the understanding of God in this part of it is very much similar to the mythological gods preceding this faith of the Yahweh faith. That God appears like a human, walks around, and you can bargain with him, and things that we really don't try now. So this shows how primitive the understanding was. And this is a context to format to set up as an introduction to the Mosaic faith that comes with the Exodus. When we get to that reading, you'll see that really when God appears to Moses in the burning bush, Moses doesn't know who this God is. So in the 400 years in captivity, whatever they had from the Abraham faith has pretty much disappeared, and it reemerges as a unique faith at the time of Moses, again with God's apparition at the burning bush, and then taking them out through the Sinai into the Holy Land, and the unique relationship between God and his chosen people. So, like I said, it's a difficult story to present in an intellectual and comprehensive way. Some of the stories are difficult, but hope you'll bear with me and understand my discomfort is okay, because I'm very human here too. So next week, the readings will be the latter part of Genesis, essentially setting up the Joseph story and why they ended up in Egypt, chapters 37, 39, 41, 45, and the early 7 verses of 46 in Genesis. Those are Genesis chapters. First 6 chapters of Exodus, and a little bit of chapter 7, 1 through 9 verses to show the setup for the Exodus story. That's the background. This is Dr. Guthrie. I appreciate your attention. Thank you very much.